If you haven't been to a last lecture series yet, it's once a year. We'll bring an honored professor to come up who may or may not be retiring. The last few years we've had Professor Scott and Professor State, both very entertaining. This year we are very fortunate and very lucky to have Professor Shreve. I know he's touched many of you throughout your classes here. I know I had him for at least 2. I'm sure some of you had him for more. You know, he's a wonderful individual, and we have been lucky to have him as a professor. So, without any further ado, Professor Shreve for his last lecture.
Well, can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. I want to begin by thanking the SBA. I'm very honored to be invited to give this lecture. And I have been spending some time on the selection of my topic. And there were several really attractive possibilities. I mean, from civil procedure. From civil procedure, I was thinking about maybe I could talk about the appropriate boundary between Federal Rule 12b-6 and Federal Rule 56, which is, as I'm sure you all know, motion to dismiss for failure to state a claim that's over here, and summary judgment is over there. And they're in this dynamic. But I also thought about conflicts and the constant and absolutely fascinating tension between multilateral and unilateral policies in choice of law methodology. And as far as my jurisprudence seminar is concerned, we could always consider the exhilarating relationship between laws and academic discipline and the features of economics or sociology. These are all wonderful topics, but I knew whatever topic I selected, I had to be careful because I had before me the example of my old federal jurisdiction teacher, Henry Hart. And Henry Hart was a giant in the field. Where I went to school is called federal courts in the federal system, but it's basically what we have here is federal jurisdiction. And one year he was asked to deliver the Holmes lecture. The Holmes lecture is a very, very important lecture at Harvard Law School. It goes on 2 consecutive nights. So you come to hear this great scholar on 2 consecutive nights. And on the first night, Henry Hart came in. The lecture began. And his topic has something to do with the federal courts. And it was an intellectually very challenging topic. But people didn't know how challenging it was because he laid out an additional series of deeper, more probing questions. And he spent his first lecture laying out these questions. And by the time that first evening lecture was over, everybody was just pressed into the back of their seats. They were, with the force, the eloquence, the power of this lecture which laid out all of these questions. The second night, he was going to come and he was going to answer them. So the time came for the second night. Everybody filled the room. But Henry Hart wasn't there. And so eventually the dean went to Henry Hart's office, which was in an old building called Langdale Hall. And frosted glass door. We could tell you there was a light on in the office. So the dean said, "Henry, it's time to go. It's time for your lecture." Silence. He said, "Henry," he sort of stood up on tiptoes so he could speak through the transom above the door. He said, Henry, come on. You don't want to be late. It's time for you to go to the lecture." And through the transom, he heard, "No." He did not have answers. To the questions that he'd raised the night before. And this is a true story. He never went to the second night. So I have to be careful I don't get in too deep. You know, this is great stuff, all of those topics that are reviewed, and many, many others. Really, really exciting stuff. But I will, if you promise not to tell anyone, I will tell you a secret. Sometimes I get the impression, I may be wrong, but sometimes I get the impression that my students are not quite as excited by this as I am. And I start out, when I get that impression, I'm a little upset. And I say, what's the matter with them? Why can't they, see the incredible richness of this material? Why aren't they excited? But then I remember what I was like when I was a law student, and I understand. Let me go back to that. In fact, let me go back just a little bit earlier. I grew up in North Georgia on a dairy farm. And that experience, long years on that dairy farm, left me with two things. First, a lifelong dislike of milk. And second, a conviction that dairy cows were among the most stupid creatures in the world. For example, my job, when we did the milking in the morning and again in the evening, my job was to go around with a big warm pail of antiseptic solution and scrub the cows, make sure their udders were clean before we put the milking machines on. And as I would do this, periodically a cow would step on my foot. Now, we're talking here about an animal, I don't know, 600, 700, 800 pounds. Once the cow stepped on my foot, it was not a matter of my removing my foot. It was a matter of the cow lifting her foot up. So this would happen to me. And it hurt. And I would turn to the cow and I'd say, would you get off my foot? And yell at the cow. The cow would nothing. I would pound on the flanks of the cow. And I'd say, get off my foot. Sometimes I would try to throw my entire weight against the flank of the cow to try to move the cow off my foot. Eventually, the cow would move, but often it took a long time. And for that reason and others that I won't go into, I ended up thinking cows were really not that swift at all. Well, much to my delight, we finally moved. And eventually, I went to the University of Oklahoma. University of Oklahoma is a really wonderful school, and in many respects, it's like IU. If you substitute football for basketball, it's very similar. After I'd gotten almost all the way through college, I had to make a decision about what to do. And I decided I'd go to law school for a couple of reasons. One, I really enjoyed arguing with people. And another is even then I sensed something very attractive for all of you when you get out about the practice of law, the profession of law. And that is you have your independence. You have an opportunity fairly to make it on your own. and not be in a situation where, let's say you're in some company and your boss is a jerk and writes bad evaluations for you or does something else that makes your life miserable. You can get on your own, do your own work, and be free in the way professionals are. So I got accepted at Harvard Law School, and I arrived and I was moving in to the apartment. And as I was moving in, there was someone moving out. And they were on their way to the University of Chicago Law School, start their law school. And we talked for a while. And this person asked me, "What's your grade point average? And what's your LSAT?" And I told them. And they became furious. This person said, "I went to Harvard College, and I had a much higher GPA than you did from the University of Oklahoma. And I took the LSAT, and I had a much higher LSAT score than you did. And I didn't get admitted at Harvard Law School." I didn't understand that, at least not for a while. Finally, I learned about a phenomenon at Harvard Law School called geographical distribution. In short, the policy at Harvard was to reach out with its beams of excellence all across the country and to shine those beams into the most benighted portions of the United States. I think I got extra points from being from Oklahoma. In any event, that's why I was there. And I had two friends. We happened to know each other. We were all from the University of Oklahoma, all took the same little major. And all three of us were admitted and attended. And their conception of geographical distribution worked perfectly, because at the end of our 3 years, we were supposed to be released like spores into the wind, and we would float back. And somehow we would raise, probably not by a great deal, but somehow we would raise, the level of civilization. In those places from which we had been drawn. The other two cooperated perfectly. They were homesick for 3 years. They didn't even stay around for commencement. They took their exams and back they were. And I double-crossed Harvard. I never went back. But I remember, just like you all do, I remember my first year. And in particular, I remember 3 professors in my first year. The first professor was my contracts professor, Clark Bice. I've never used names until now. But, this is a big confessional today. Just going to let it all hang out. This guy is named Clark Bice. He is a sadistic monster. And as luck would have it, we were so regimented, we were assigned our seat, all the seats were numbered, and we were assigned our seat in every course. And as luck would have it, I was right under his nose in the first row center. And he was someone who should not have been left alone with us in the room without supervision. He was so awful to everyone. And I remember one day, I was in class, and I said something to him, called on me, I guess. And he said, "Why did you come up with that?" I said, well, it says here in my notes. And he says, wait a minute, everybody, wait a minute. Listen carefully, because this is something from Mr. Shreve's note. Well, years later, I had gone back to Harvard to be a teaching fellow, a number of years later. And one of the things that you get to do as a teaching fellow is that you get to use the faculty library. And so I was up there really, really late one night, and I noticed on the other side of the library is Professor Bice doing some photocopying. I don't know, you probably know how it is if you're in your office or someplace and it's really, really late and the building is empty. How you just finally get that feeling you're the only person in the world and everything's so quiet. Well, I very carefully walked up until I was right behind Professor Bice. And I said, "Hello, Professor Bice." He just about jumped out of his skin. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. I've always cherished that memory. And I also remember my civil procedure professor, Benjamin Kaplan, another great. I think he actually wrote some of the original Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. And he was going down the seating chart, and he finally got to me. And he said, "Well, Mr. Shreve, what is the difference between substance and procedure?" Well, to buy some time, I said, "Oh, Professor Kaplan, that's a difficult question." He said, "Well, that may be. Mr. Stone, what is the difference?" And the conversation went on for the rest of the hour between Mr. Stone, Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Smith, and so forth, and I never had another word to say. Well, as my life took certain turns and I ended up being a teacher of civil procedure, I realized what a wonderful question that Professor Kaplan had given me. One of the great questions. And I would think about what happened. And I'd start imagining the answer that I could have given. And I would think about it some more. And in my imagination, the answers kept getting better and better until finally, in my imagination, I answer the question and Professor Kaplan comes up and shakes my hand. But you really can't go back. And I got the impression after that, Professor Kaplan wasn't that interested in anything I had to say. He'd say something, he'd go on. I didn't think he was really listening to me. So finally, I decided what I would do the next time I raised my hand to say something, he'd call on me. And I'd say what I wanted to say, and he'd go blah, 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 and blow it off and go on to someone else. At which point I would say, "Oh, Professor Kaplan, that's just my point." And I did it. And Professor Kaplan called on me. I made a point. He said, "Oh," when someone else, I said, "Oh, Professor Kaplan, that's just my point." And for a moment, it was wonderful. For a moment, I could see, it's like the tape had slipped off the reel, I could see. He was saying, "What did he say?" What did I say? I heard from him not that long ago. He wrote me a nice letter. He really liked understanding civil procedure. He was using it in his class. And I wrote him a letter back and I thanked him. And I said something obscure like, "I'm so glad I'm finally able to show the good results of your fine teaching. The letter I really wanted to write was, "Thank you, Professor Kaplan. I guess I didn't do that badly for someone who got a in your class." But I didn't have the heart. And of course, I mean, he absolutely had no idea who I was. And then, Alan Dershowitz was my professor in criminal law. He was in his first year of teaching. And I really liked his class. And when the time came for exams and the grades came back, I got an A from him, which was in stark contrast to all of my other grades. It could have been, I guess, that I did enjoy his class, but I think I know why it was. He only had one question on the exam, and it was my moot court problem. It really was. And I answered that question. I was citing Court of Appeals opinions. I mean, I really answered that question. I was just like, I guess, almost all of you. I was very nervous. Really wanted to talk for the first time. And I waited. And I waited. And finally, I thought I had something to say. Still very early in the semester, I thought I could say something. So I kind of closed my eyes. And I put up my hand. And what I failed to notice was that my neighbor, we were at a long table. My neighbor at that moment was reaching for something that he had dropped. And when I put up my hand, I hit him in the side of the head. And knocked his glasses off. We were never close. Didn't really run into him again until the quarterfinal round of our moot court competition, which was in the first part of the third year, or no, the last part of the second year, but it doesn't matter. We had at that time an intramural competition, and there were 8-person teams, and of those 8, 2 were oralists, and they actually did the argument. And I was an oralist, and he was an oralist. We met in the quarterfinal round, and I beat him again. Some things are better, of course, now. For example, then there was a dress code. And the dress code was suits. But it wasn't long till I was showing up for class in jeans and cowboy boots. And I remember I was in class one day, and our distinguished board of visitors was at the school, Wall Street lawyers, judges, and so forth. And they sat in the classroom, watched the classes, and I had one of them sitting right next to me. And of course he was resplendent in his 3-piece suit. Sits next to me, and he just sort of looks at me. Looks me up and down, kind of scowls. I just shrugged my shoulders and said, "Geographical distribution." After I left law school, I was, of course, by then absolutely convinced, since my highest grade in law school was criminal law, that I was destined for an entire life involving criminal law. It took me 1 year to realize that I did like to litigate, but no offense to the professional community, and certainly no offense to my colleagues in the criminal area, but it was just not what I wanted to do. But I went to work for Elliot Richardson right out of law school. Elliot Richardson was a wonderful boss. I was at that time a moderate Republican, a species that is now extinct. But a year after I was there, he went to Washington, one of his many trips, taking a cabinet appointment, released us from our commitments. And I did something that I really wanted to do anyway, and that is I went to clerk for a federal judge. I went to work for Judge Sarah T. Hughes, United States District Court, Northern District of Texas, in Dallas, Texas. You hear these stories of clerks who go to clerk for someone, and they are, kind of liberal, some of them, and so they try to work in their politics, and they try to radicalize their judges a little bit. Well, in my case, she radicalized me. She was so courageous in her sense of justice for all people that she converted me for life, really. It was the greatest year I had. We had a number of cases that year that were really interesting, and one reason was because of a procedural phenomenon that has since all but disappeared. I haven't checked for a few years, maybe it's completely gone by now. An institution called a 3-judge district court. The 3-judge court came into existence because single federal judges, when called upon to consider the constitutionality of state law, were, in the opinion of Congress, just a little too ready to strike those state laws down. So if we had a 3-judge court with 3 federal judges, they would counsel each other to be restrained, and we wouldn't have so many statutory invalidations. Well, it turned out just the opposite happened. You get 3 judges, you get kind of a critical mass. They get a little rowdy. And if anything, more statutes were invalidated. But the great thing in terms of my experience was appeal from a 3-judge court decision was most of the time directly to the United States Supreme Court, and it was an appeal. So I had the opportunity to see a number of my cases that I worked on reach the United States Supreme Court. And just to tell you about a few of them, we had a case called Buchanan versus Batchelor, attacking the Texas sodomy law. This was well before Bowers. The 3-judge court struck down the sodomy law. However, the decision was vacated because the Supreme Court had started a construction project, which went on for years, to gradually close the door of the federal courthouse if there was any kind of judicial activity going on the state side. The Civil Rights Act, Title 28, 1983, was enacted during the Reconstruction because of a conviction that federal court judges might be more open, more willing fully to vindicate federal civil rights law than state judges. But in time, the Supreme Court started saying, well, state judges have taken an oath to support the Constitution. We're certainly not going to assume that they will not be as vigorous in the discharge of that duty as a federal judge would be. And therefore, we'll leave it to the state courts. this is true even when the means for the person to raise the civil rights claim in the state court was as a defense in a criminal prosecution. Supreme Court said, well, all right, maybe that's not quite as comfortable a posture for the person who wants to raise the federal civil rights defense. Maybe there's a certain wear and tear on the litigant, but that's a price to be paid in the name of federalism. And sure enough, what the three-judge court in Buchanan versus Batchelor tried to do was to enjoin a state prosecution. And the Supreme Court vacated and said, no, you can't do that. But the reasoning of the court on the merits was, it sort of anticipated what happened in the Bowers case. The second case, a case called Pate versus McElman, went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court affirmed on the merits in a nice opinion. And the three-judge challenge there was incredibly high filing fees to run for municipal office in Dallas County. For a minor office, you might have to pay a $25,000 filing fee. Our three-judge court said, and the Supreme Court agreed, that that was unconstitutional. And then the case, the three-judge case I worked on, which has had the most lasting significance, was Roe v. Wade. And my judge, by the way, gave me permission as I left to say as much about it and what I was involved in it as I will today. You're all familiar with Roe v. Wade. I might start with the oral argument to the three-judge court in the federal courthouse in Dallas, Texas. If that case was decided as a moot court round, giving the decision to the team or the advocate who did the best job, the three-judge court would have sided with the state of Texas and upheld the Texas abortion statute. Again, I'm naming names here. I will not leave a forwarding address. I'm naming names. Sarah Weddington. Sarah Weddington has been dining out on her success in Roe v. Wade for many years now. I watched her argue that case. I have never seen a more wretched oral argument. I've never judged a round in law school that was that bad. It didn't matter because that court knew where they wanted to go. And that's what they did. Judge Hughes was on the court. She was the presiding judge, is always the Court of Appeals judge. The three-judge courts are made up, or were made up, of 2 district court judges and 1 Court of Appeals judge. But Judge Hughes had been waiting for this case. Judge Hughes had been on the bench in state court for several decades before she went on to the federal court appointed by Johnson. She used to sit on cases in state court, jury cases, where women were barred from the jury. And it bothered her to death, so she eventually was very, very instrumental, finally, in getting that law changed. Judge Hughes was someone who came up and went really very far with no choice other than to inhabit, cope with, and somehow try to advance in a very, very bad situation in terms of women's rights. And she did it. The people who were her political colleagues were men, because that's basically all there were. And she got along with them very well. She loved FDR. She loved Kennedy. She loved Johnson. Johnson was a good friend. I'd get a phone call in her chambers, and it would be Johnson. He'd say, "Where's Sarah?" But she'd been waiting for this case. And so there was the oral argument, and they all went into actually her chambers, not the Court of Appeals justice, but her chambers. They all went into her chambers. They were in there for a couple hours. Finally, they came out. Mac Taylor, the other district judge, a sort of moderate Democrat, nice guy. Judge Irving Goldberg, protege of Lyndon Johnson, Court of Appeals judge, strong, liberal, intelligent. But they were the first two out, and they were utterly exhausted. They were disheveled, bedraggled. They sort of staggered out of the room, Judge Hughes' office. And then came Judge Hughes, bouncing out of the room, smiling. Judge Hughes, incidentally, was not quite 5 feet tall. She didn't weigh 100 pounds. One of the most frightening people I ever encountered. And just determined. In fact, she was the captain of her college basketball team. Well, she comes out, she's in great spirits, and she says, all right, it's unanimous, and we've decided that we all feel so strongly and we want to put forward such a degree of solidarity that nobody's going to write this opinion. It's going to be per curiam. We think of per curiam as minor. There have been historic moments like Brown v. Board where per curiam is used for just the opposite, to show the degree of solidarity of the court. And they said, okay, you did the bench memo. We pretty much want to do it the way it is in the bench memo, so you can draft the per curiam opinion, which I did. And it was circulated, and each of the judges made a little change, but basically it was that way. And then we waited. There were 2 grounds for invalidating the Texas statute, anti-abortion statute. The statute was like so many at the time, and it said, no abortion except to save the life of the mother. Our first ground was that since this was a criminal statute, it gave insufficient notice what was a crime, and hence violated due process. What is necessary to save the life of the mother? Does it mean that if she goes through the term, she may suffer some health which diminishes, or possibly not kills her, may diminish her longevity? What if she is incredibly depressed and there's a strong likelihood that she will attempt to commit suicide if she's forced to carry the child? What does save the life of the mother mean? Well, the first case that's decided is a case called Voight versus United States. It comes out of the District of Columbia, where the District of Columbia Court has struck down the statute on this argument, due process notice argument. And Douglas, it's very gratifying because Douglas writes an opinion, and he takes my language right out of the per curiam opinion and says, as the district court said, what is necessary to save the life? Is it this? Is it that? It was very gratifying, except he was a dissenter. That was the end of the due process argument. That left the other argument. The other argument was based upon the rights of the woman, control over her body, the same being a fundamental interest, and therefore subjected to a very high level of scrutiny, which the statute, and for that matter any statute criminalizing abortion, could not pass. And of course, how is the Supreme Court going to rule on that? And for that we have to wait until the Supreme Court takes up 2 cases, Roe v. Wade and one other, and we know how they rule. I would still today do what I did then. I would write the same bench memo, I'd make the same recommendation. But I would also say that I don't know of a more painful or difficult question that the Supreme Court has ever had to face than the one in Roe v. Wade. To be able to terminate the fetus means that you kill something that is alive, something that has little hands, little feet, the beginnings of little eyes, nose, heartbeat. You know, the fetus is not ever going to be on a bottle of Gerber baby food. It's not very pretty. But as John Hart Ely said in a famous article, maybe the fetus isn't a person, but it's not nothing. And it's a very, very difficult question. Question that, of course, has torn this country apart. Well, I'd like to turn my attention a little bit to what it's like to have been here, and the great pleasure and good fortune I had to be able to come here. And one of those pleasures is, of course, the students, and watching the students after they leave. And actually, some of them come back. I have three in mind. One is Professor Mark Janus. Professor Janus was my student in conflicts. He was a sharpshooter, sat in the back of the room, never said anything. When I would struggle to make a difficult point, he would shake his head sadly. And as you know, he got an award yesterday, the highest award we can give for teaching, the Wallace Award. Another of my students, Associate Dean Catherine Matthews. I don't know if Catherine's here. Are you here, Catherine? Hi, Catherine. Catherine is a person of very good judgment. She only had one lapse, of which I'm aware. She took 3 courses from me. Always a wonderful student. And in the jurisprudence seminar, she completely turned me around with reference to a leading figure in the movement of feminist jurisprudence, whose writing I thought I understood, but I didn't. A writer by the name of McKinnon. And I don't agree with everything she says, but I certainly from that point on read her with new eyes. And then finally, I'd like to mention a wonderful former student I had, Dennis Moore. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance to know Dennis. He was a student in my civil procedure class. He also came back. He taught courses in Uniform Commercial Code. He was a wonderful teacher and a dear friend and colleague of mine. Unfortunately, we lost Dennis not too long ago. And indeed, there's been a fair amount of sadness around here with the loss of Professor Pat Bode, the loss of Lynn Fromm. Some great people. Our hearts have gone out to their families, and they are greatly missed. What else have I been left with? Well, one thing I've been left with is the absolute confidence in the ability of potential of every single student in the law school. Every single student. We're in a fortunate position in terms of what we can do in admissions. Everybody we admit has the tickets, can go just as far as they want. And what I would do, and this draws from my personal experience, is make particularly sure that you understand that, even if you're not at the top of the class. I'm about to tell you something which will lead to my being instructed to vacate my office within 48 hours. I don't know what my rank was in law school. I certainly didn't want to know. But I'm quite certain I was in the bottom quarter of the class, which makes me different than most people here, who did very well and were on law review. Of course, in one particular respect, they're not at all like my classmates who are on law review, because my colleagues here who are on law review are nice people. But I am somewhat different that way. And when I tell you this, I need to believe it, because I'm talking about myself as well. Never let anyone tell you what you're worth. Never. You're all able, every one of you, to go out and do anything you want to do. The only thing that keeps that from happening sooner rather than later, perhaps, is the economy. But it's certainly going to happen. And I would simply close by identifying the most important thing that you leave law school with. And it's nothing we have a class about, but it's your own character and your own integrity. It will not be long once you leave here that you will begin facing a series of decisions and choices that you'll continue to face for the rest of your lives about how good a lawyer you want to be. Not how good you can be, but whether you are going to be that good. And just what it means when you give your word. Just what it means when you sign a pleading or another document. Lawyers are involved in all kinds of situations, which makes our course in professional responsibility necessary. The one thing lawyers can never do, they can never say, well, I have pretty good instincts about what's right and what's wrong. Because you need to learn those rules of professional responsibility. Some of them seem in the beginning to be counterintuitive. Some of them, after you think about them for a long time, continue to seem counterintuitive, which makes it important to learn them. But beyond that, there are certain basic human instincts that matter. You're doing service if you have clients. And in certain vital respects, that makes you no different than, let's say, an automobile mechanic. If I take my old truck to an automobile mechanic, I expect, and I'm entitled to expect, three things. That the problem will be fixed, that I won't have to pay more than I reasonably should, and it won't take me forever to get my truck back. Those same three things in terms of the work you do as a lawyer, the quality of the work, the price you charge, and how long it takes you to do it, are centrally important and have a lot to do with your own sense of personal professional responsibility. But it's been great to be here. Every year I go to the first year orientation picnic and it's the same thing, such nice people. I came from the Northeast, I don't understand it. Maybe there's something in the water, I don't know. Maybe it's just the Midwest, I don't know. But one of the greatest single thing that I have found and enjoyed in my time here is the quality, the human quality of the students. How well they treat us, certainly, but most important, how well you treat each other. So thank you for letting me be here. Thanks very much.